A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
First, let's go to Andrew McColl from Family Voice Australia. Andrew, welcome to the program.
Good morning, Andrew, and good morning, listeners.
Andrew, let's look at this misinformation and disinformation bill. This can seems to have been kicked around for a while now. What is the latest on it?
Well, let's go back a little bit into the background, Andrew, and talk about what we need in a democratic country such as Australia. I would like to suggest that any democratic country, in fact, every country, needs public debate that is robust, frank, and vigorous. Now, the question is, will that always be perfectly truthful? Probably not, because politicians, unfortunately, are not famous for always telling the truth or perhaps even the whole truth. There can be advantages from being deceitful to the electorate, but there are also huge downsides as well. One of those is electoral rejection, which no politician is keen to risk. This means that political deception is a very dangerous game to play, and every politician knows that. So promoting misinformation and disinformation legislation to a sceptical electorate, when political propaganda is one of the hallmarks of dictators, is also a highly risky strategy to engage in. Now, when we look at the scripture, we find that Nathanael in John's Gospel, chapter 1, was unfairly sceptical when he said concerning Jesus, "Can any good thing come out of Nazareth?" That's John chapter 1, verse 46. But when it comes to the legislators that want to be passing laws with a doubtful intent and motivation, the saying that we've commonly heard seems readily appropriate. If it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, and quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck.
And that's probably true too, Andrew. So when did this misinformation commence?
Well, Andrew, I think that misinformation began in the Garden of Eden, when the serpent said to the woman, Eve, when was considering her options, he said to her, "You shall not die if you do what God told you not to do." We know that the devil is the father of lies. So lying is normal for him. We Christians should be awake to that, are we? We may find it in advertising or even political advertising. In fact, government misinformation has a long and ugly history. We find it in scripture in 1 Kings 21, when Ahab coveted Naboth's vineyard. When Naboth refused to sell it to Ahab, his awful wife Jezebel confidently assured her foolish husband, "I'll fix this problem for you, big boy." Her way of fixing it was to hire some worthless characters to testify against Naboth. Using what? Why, government misinformation, of course. Innocent Naboth was stoned to death, and Ahab went down there to take possession. He thought he'd got that vineyard. Not so fast, big boy. The Lord had another planned outcome for this shedding of Naboth's innocent blood. Things didn't work out quite the way that little Miss Jezebel had planned. Her husband died in battle, and she was thrown out of a window to be eaten by dogs. That's in 2 Kings chapter 9, verses 30 to 37. So, Andrew, I'm going to suggest today that good legislation should be derived from the 10 Commandments. The relevant commandment in the context of misinformation and disinformation is the 9th commandment. This commands us, "You shall not bear false witness against your neighbour," in Exodus 20, verse 9. So along with coveting, stealing and murder, this was what Jezebel and Ahab were guilty of. Now, Paul expanded on this law in the New Testament in Ephesians chapter 4, verses 14 to 16, when he instructed the Ephesians that we are no longer to be children, tossed here and there by waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by craftiness in deceitful scheming, but speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up into all aspects into him who is the head, even Christ. So God requires of me that I be honest with my neighbour and tell the truth when I speak about him to others or in a court of law. If I don't do this, our relationship will suffer, his public reputation may suffer, and I may even cause or contribute to a miscarriage of justice if a criminal accusation has been falsely brought against him. The Bible does warn us, Andrew, that a false witness will not go unpunished, and he who tells lies will not escape. That's Proverbs chapter 19, verse 5. And it also warns us, he who goes about as a slanderer reveals secrets. Therefore, do not associate with a gossip, in Proverbs chapter 20, verse 19.
Yeah, so, but if governments perpetuate misinformation or disinformation themselves, their own behaviour will quickly come under scrutiny from a critical electorate that will sniff out government hypocrisy, Andrew.
Well, and it's so important that we consider misinformation or disinformation in the context of what governments say and governments do. Now, the opposition communications spokesman David Coleman said about this bill, which was withdrawn by Labor in November and redrafted, last year, and following harsh criticism of its overreach, had no place in Australia. Mr. Coleman said, the bill gives digital platforms an enormous financial incentive to censor statements made by everyday Australians. If the government decides that they have not censored enough misinformation, they can face large fines, Mr. Coleman said. Senator Alex Antic has also claimed that this bill would allow the Australian Communications and Media Authority, that's ACMA, to issue fines of up to $3,130,000 or 2% of annual turnover for body corporates, such as social media platforms, or $626,000 for individuals like you or me, Andrew. Obviously, this places immense pressure on social media platforms to remove opinions that are not government approved and discourages individual users from contradicting the current government narratives. Even Lorraine Finlay, the Australian Human Rights Commissioner, has commented that if we fail to ensure robust safeguards for freedom of expression online, then the measures taken to combat misinformation and disinformation could themselves risk undermining Australia's democracy and freedoms.
Yeah, so all of this points to two things, Andrew. So firstly, the passing of this legislation gives the government of the day greater powers over certain social media platforms and individuals who fail to censor according to government approval, making them liable to prosecution. But let's talk about that, Andrew. According to government approval, how does that look to you?
Well, it looks as if the person or people going through the process are going to look at what you or I or someone else has said, Andrew, and say, well, is it really suiting our political campaign or our election campaign? How is that not going to be tainted in some way by a parliamentarian who's really keen to win his next election and really keen to make sure that he doesn't upset his political mates in the parliament, his party? So the matter of justice may get shuffled to the back of the bus, Andrew, and your reputation, or mine, could get trashed simply because you become expendable. And so what happens in this, or what could easily happen, is that and this is the second and more important even, is that the government itself isn't subject to its own requirements about misinformation, so that it's one law for the government and one for me and you, mate. So, and guess who's going to come off second best out of that exchange? Andrew. So they can promote whatever misinformation they wish and not be held to account. Now, this is very provocative and controversial. So I've got you probably know about the social commentator Bettina Arndt. She started out as a feminist, and this week she wrote, "The misinformation bill is an outrageous infringement of our civil liberties, putting our freedom of speech into the hands of a government-appointed entity." We all saw how this worked out during the COVID years. As I pointed out many times, this concentration of power is bound to result in even more draconian laws and regulations adversely affecting on men, with feminists running so many of our institutions.
That is a big call from a former feminist, isn't it? That she's actually concerned about men being impacted by draconian laws like this. But it does sound like the work or the activities of a totalitarian or authoritarian government, doesn't it? Wanting to protect itself and have total control over the flow of information in society.
Well, it does. And these are the things that we need to be clear about. As I said earlier, the Bible, what Jesus said, that Satan is the father of all lies. So what we can see already is that misinformation and disinformation laws are the very height of government hypocrisy. And this is where we must draw the line and refuse to accept this kind of legislation, throwing out the perpetrators when we get a chance. Now, so these are what we can do. These are the kind of things that we can do, Andrew, in a free country. Hey, we get to vote. Hey, we also get to vote in not too many months from now. So we can remember the day that we walk into the ballot box. It might be as early as March next year, that not very long ago, there were certain people in the parliament who were perpetrating this nonsense, this means of abuse against people like you and me and the general person in the street, and we can throw them out when we want to. Otherwise, good and innocent people will suffer as a consequence. Andrew, maybe your federal MP and my federal MP need to hear from us, not just because we're on radio doing talkback radio, but we're basically Australians in the street who've got strong views about these things and need to speak to our MPs about them.
I think you're right there, 100%. Not just you and I, Andrew, but all of our listeners across Australia. I think we need to get more engaged in the political space as Christians, because it feels like more and more of these laws or these bills are being proposed that will definitely infringe on our religious freedoms. Because really, when you talk about misinformation, I can't prove scientifically that there's a heaven or hell. I can't prove there's a God. I can't prove that his word is truth. And so if I'm communicating that, really, I could easily be accused of misinformation, couldn't I? Because I can't take someone to heaven or hell and say, well, that's where it is right there. That proves that what I'm saying is true.
Well, all of this is true, Andrew, and it's important that we maintain that in a free country, individuals ought to have, I'm not saying they have, but they ought to have free speech. Now, there's no such thing, of course, as absolute free speech. We do have defamation laws in our country, which, in my opinion, are based on the 9th commandment: you shall not speak for or propagate false witness against your neighbour. We can do those things in a country like Australia, and it's important that we can do so. But you also need to be able to engage in free speech about parliamentary actions, political activities that we think we want to say something about, and that is what everyone in the community should be pretty sensitive about, so that they can go to public meetings where things are being addressed that certain parliamentarians don't want spoken about. Guess what, parliamentarians? We want to. That's the community. That's what it is in for. So we want to be able to say what we want in a public space, and we don't want people walking in and saying, well, you're going to be guilty, mate, of misinformation and disinformation, and we'll prosecute you.
Yeah. Well said, Andrew. And if any one of our listeners want to find out more, Family Voice Australia, their website is familyvoice.org.au. That's familyvoice.org.au. I've been talking to Andrew McColl from Family Voice. And Andrew, as always, very enlightening and very true and really a sober warning for all of us to really make sure and hold our politicians to account, because we do not want this bill passed, do we?
Andrew.
I think we've had a bit of a technical hitch there, but Andrew, thanks for joining us and looking forward to your next contribution on 2020 next week. Have a great weekend.
Thank you, Andrew. It's always a pleasure.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.